on 1-year and 2-year leases. Hector Robertson is president of the Washington Avenue Botanic Block Association on the frontier of Crown Heights South that has nothing but buildings along the strip. Welcome to Brooklyn 45.
Thank you, Mr. Tate, for having me.
Does the size of this rent increase surprise you?
No, it doesn't. It's a political year, it's an election year. We had a couple of years of rent freeze. And so inevitably, what was going to happen this year is that there was going to be some kind of rent increase. Fortunately for many of the renters in New York City, it's been a slight increase to the rent increase for this year. The Rent Stabilization Association, if they had it their way, they would have had a 4% increase for 1 year, or a 6% increase for 2 years. Fortunately, the rent guideline boards voted 7-2 to actually have a modest increase this year of 1.25% for 1 year and 2% for 2 years.
How does that work for people who are not tenants and who don't quite understand the 1 year, the size of the 1 year, and the size of the 2 year?
If you have to be a renter to actually understand how this really affects you as a renter. If you're not a renter, you really don't understand it. So there is a lot of different ways in which this affects the actual renters throughout New York City, especially in the areas of Crown Heights, where there is a cluster of people who have multiple jobs in order to actually make that rent at the end of the month or at the beginning of the month, whichever way they do it.
And you did say especially Crown Heights, so it's almost all over Brooklyn?
It is almost all over Brooklyn, where you find people that are work for the city of New York, for example, that have 2 and 3 jobs that cannot make the rent or ends meet within their own family's environment. So this is particularly difficult in Crown Heights. I look at Crown Heights because I run that organization along Washington Avenue. And so the tenants that come to our meeting express their frustration on how to really deal with the day-to-day of their lives, with the rent increases, the increase in the cost of living. Raising their families in Brooklyn becomes a burden. And so with the new influx of people in Crown Heights, especially in the area of Crown Heights South, you have people that are coming in that don't understand what this really means for a person who lives in Crown Heights for 30 or 40 years.
Who are these new people you're talking about, the whites who are coming?
We're talking about all of the gentrification that's happening in the area. So these are transient people that come into the neighborhood. They're there for a year or two, and then they're gone. But the people that stay here feel the brunt. The way they feel the brunt is that when they come in and they take an apartment, usually what the building owner does, he cosmetically fixes this apartment, rent it for above market rate, and then when they cannot afford it anymore, they leave. The problem with that is that rent stays as a stigma, as a staple of that unit. And many people that then come after these people don't really have the know-how to go to DHCR, the Department of Housing and Community Renewal, and get a rent history on that unit. And so that rent stays high for anyone that comes after whoever's renting that unit.
What's the benefit of knowing the rent history?
Well, it's important because building owners have a tendency of cosmetically fixing apartments. They don't really invest the money, if you will, to actually make the apartment up to standards or market standards. And so when you walk into a building and you know that there is a vacancy and you are told that the unit is $2,000 a month, well, as a new tenant, you're supposed to go down to DHCR, get a rent history. Don't tell the building owner that you're doing this. Just go down there, get a rent history, see what was the last rent paid for that unit, and then you can come back to the owner and say, I want the last rent, the last legal rent on this unit.
Do they have to give you that rent?
They do. By law, they do, because that's the last legal rent on that unit.
You mentioned earlier that The rent increase does not surprise you because this is a political year. Explain that.
Well, it's election year for a lot of city council members, especially. And so the mayor is actually also running for re-election. And so the real estate board is a very powerful board in this city. A lot of people who want to curry favors with the mayor really have to play ball in terms of the political atmosphere in this city. And 2 years of freeze rent is good for the people of the city of New York, but I believe that the mayor had to make a decision as to whether or not he will allow the rent board to actually do an increase, but not as the lobbyists expected him to do, which was a 4 or 6 year lease for 2 years.
And these are the lobbyists on behalf of the owners.
Being owners, yes.
So who are the lobbyists on behalf of the tenants?
We don't have one. But there's no lobbyists in behalf of the tenant. The history of New York in terms of how this rent guideline board operates really is geared towards the building owners. Tenants have very little remedy when it comes to advocacy within the city of New York, within the rent guideline boards. So a lot of the people in the city of New York have to hope and pray that politicians, the rent guideline board, and even the real estate industry, which, by the way, they don't really care too much about increases in cost of living, any other expenses that tenants have to go through. It's not something that they have in mind when they actually want their money. And so what happens then is that you have to be able to have organizations, coalitions to go after the politicians, to try to put a case together from a tenant's perspective, so that they can actually sway in the way of the tenant, whether slightly or completely, like the mayor did for a 2-year rent freeze.
Okay. Now, you said that there are no lobbyists on behalf of the tenants, but you do have tenant associations. So what's the power of the tenant association?
Well, we try to put the pressure on the politicians to actually really be advocates to the tenant. This is how we got the mayor to actually really freeze the rent. Because for years, the lobbyists were actually getting these astronomical increases from the rent guideline board. And so those 2 years were a lot of pressure that many city I don't want to say anti development or anti building owners, but people that were feeling the hurt went to the mayor and said, we need some relief. And that's how those 2 years came about.
So you had a rent freeze for 2 years.
2 years.
What happened before that rent freeze?
Well, we were paying those increases. The city was paying those increases. The mayor had, I think, if I remember correctly, 2 appointees to the rent guideline board since it's been appointed. But before that, when the Bloomberg administration was in office, this city saw astronomical rent increases from, I think the highest we've seen is about 6% the last time Mayor Bloomberg was in office. And so I think the mayor made a commitment to try to eliminate the notion that this city is going to see that kind of rent increases in the future or as long as he's mayor.
Talk to me about this preferential rent and this arbitrary removal of preferential rent.
Preferential rent is something that a lot of the landlords are using on certain tenants. If you're a tenant, you rather have the preferential rent. The landlord will not hesitate to get into a lease agreement with you. But preferential rent really doesn't give you a lot of remedies. The landlord can actually terminate you at any given time. They may give you a favorable rent, but that doesn't really go a long way if you cannot do certain things in your apartment.
There was a court case, I understand, last year. And tell me a bit about the court case. And apparently that said that the board should take into account the burden that's put on renters. What was significant about that court case?
Well, what was significant was that they withheld the mayor's decision to freeze the rent. Okay. So they upheld that decision based on those very 2 points. They wanted to take into account the cost of living in New York City and the fact that many families just could not afford anything above 1 or 2%, which is what we got this time around.
Specifically, what is important important that you want people to know?
What I wanted people to know is that this rent guideline board is probably not doing a whole lot of justice to the people of New York, because I believe that there are just too many tools that the building owners have against renters. Major capital improvement, MCI, is one of them. I think that every single building in the city of New York is affected by MCI, which means that if the building owner decides to change all of the windows in the building, they pass on that cost to every single tenant in that building for the duration of your lease. So that means that even after you pay up that bill, you continue to pay as long as you own, you occupy that unit. So that is a strike against every single tenant in the city of New York. And if you look around you, you see all these buildings. There is no need for MCI anymore in this city, because these building owners are making more money than ever before. Okay, and the contrast to that is that renters are spending more of their salaries into rent, more than ever before. So that MCI, as far as I'm concerned, and many others around the city, is completely obsolete. And the second thing I want them to know is that the deregulation of these units is coming fast and furious, because once the threshold for any apartment unit in New York City reaches $2,700, that building owner has the right to deregulate that unit, to deregulate as many as they can. So what we're looking at is that the stock of apartments in New York City is shrinking with every passing year that this board, they need to slow down the rate of these increases, because the more they push and the more they push, those thresholds will reach the 2,700 mark, and that's going to be a problem in the city.
Tough for you, tough work for you, tough for the tenants.
Very tough.
I suppose some people will say the marginal size of the rent increase is tough for the landlords as well.
Well, the landlords, like I said before, are making more money than ever. Yeah. So I believe that 1.25% for 1 year and 2% for 2 years is really not a big sacrifice for them. I think that they have grown to just have these astronomical increases that now they're just not very happy with this.
Hector Robertson. You should have corrected me.
That's okay.
And you are the president of the Washington Avenue Botanic Block Association.
Yes, this organization has been in effect for the last nearly 20 years. I run it with my wife, and we try to bring information to the community, because there's a lot of people in the community, especially senior citizens, that don't have the time to run around and get that information that they need to be able to stay in the units. So we bring that information to them. We bring politicians to actually answer the questions that they need answered. Where to get the services, how to get the services. And there is one group that we work very closely with that I need to mention tonight.
Yeah, but do it quickly, because we've only got 15 seconds.
In 15 seconds. The Brooklyn Housing is a organization in Brooklyn for the last 38 years, helping tenants get information on how to file documents with DHCR, how to file documents with the courts. They are very good. They're very essential to every single tenant that lives in New York. You can go to brooklynhousing.org.
Thank you, Hector Robertson.
Thank you.
Next, Pat Jacobs will be chatting with a young